Hi there. I guess it's probably morning where most of you are, or maybe not. I have no idea. So yeah, thanks for taking a little bit of time. I'm Marshall, and just a quick word about me before I launch in and start babbling about creative writing careers. Um, so, as has been said, I am the course leader and senior lecturer at Falmouth University here in the UK. You can probably tell by now from the accent, I am not actually British. I'm from the States, but I've lived and worked here in England about 5.5 years. And so I manage the creative writing online BA program here at Falmouth. Um, been in that role for about 4 years now. I came to academia as an author first. I sold my first novel back in 2002 or something like that. And so I'm up to about 20 books now, either that I wrote or that I edited or that I jointly edited with somebody else. I also came to this via publishing. I actually started and ran a small press while I was living in Hong Kong about 15 years ago, and then I moved to England in 2020, and it followed me. So I have pretty extensive publishing background as well, and then I decided, well, since my life is already so easy and simple, why don't I go do a PhD in creative writing, as one does? So I can look at publishing and writing from the standpoint of being a writer first, of being a publisher, and now being an academic. Um, and so in terms of careers, and I guess this would be a good moment to show you what I'm talking about. There's a number of different ways that you can go with creative writing as a career. And I'm also going to talk about kind of how you access that. And then I have a few more thoughts after that, as it says on the list, and then I will hopefully manage to not run out of time. But if I do, someone will probably just come along and press a button. I guess the thing you probably want to know if you're here is creative writing. Like it's a thing you can study at university. And that's, I'm finding after some years in this line of work, not a thing people often know. Because you're not taught in secondary school. If you're taught anything about creative writing, most of the time it's like an adjunct to your English class or an adjunct to some language class that you're taking, but there's not really a dedicated course of study. At university, it very much is. So you've got multiple different kind of specializations of creative writing, not just like creative writing itself, but then different specializations. Like, for example, one thing we also have here at Falmouth is games writing. And if you weren't aware, like that was a thing you could get a degree in at university, you totally can. Um, so anyway, just a bit of background there, and I'm going to make sure I have my notes on my iPad down here. So like I make sure the screen doesn't turn off. So like the most famous conception of what it means to be a creative writer is like the famous novelist, and you've seen that in films and TV series, read it in books. Like, somebody writes a novel and then all of this amazing stuff happens and they're famous and they go on TV and they have lots of money and they live in a big house and everything's great. That's really much more of a myth than a reality. It's not impossible, but that kind of thing, when it happens, it's kind of like hitting the lottery, more than being a thing you can necessarily set out to do. And so that it's helpful to frame your expectations that way. Um, Not totally impossible, but it does require some very strategic thinking from kind of early on. Um, Another way that you can use a creative writing degree is in journalism. You can obviously major in journalism as a course of study. Here at Falmouth, we have a creative writing and journalism degree. But that's one thing that if you start out in that, sometimes we do have students that find, okay, working in fiction and nonfiction is cool. Journalism is what I really like to do. Um, Content creation is emerging as a separate course of study. If you're really intrigued by just the digital landscape and want to be able to like create material for it, to do writing that's really focused on like the web and digital media, that's a thing now. Games writing, like I mentioned, if you're an avid gamer and you also kind of like writing, you might not have known yet, you can totally study that. That is a career. You can write for games. Um, Script and screenwriting, obviously, Netflix has to get the scripts for those TV series somewhere. That would be because people write them. It can be quite lucrative. The publishing industry, it's massive. So obviously, you can go from creative writing into a publishing career. Advertising is also another way you can go with it. Academia is another way. So if you want to be a university professor in creative writing while also having a sort of side career as a writer, which is how I kind of navigate it. That's very much an opportunity as well. So if you're thinking about like, how do you get into this? What do I do to position myself better to get into one of these careers? I think, if you're sort of at the casting around at, prior to starting university stage, one useful thing is to think about starting to do some of the research now, while you theoretically have the time. Start looking around at like what are the universities actually offering in terms of creative writing courses? Like, and it may sound really simple and obvious, but like looking to see, okay, such and such university has a degree in creative writing, but then like who graduated from there? Or, maybe a university has a games writing program. And again, where have their graduates gone on to work? What are they doing? What are the different modules? And here in the UK, that's what we call the different courses on the program. What classes do you have to take along the way? Because sometimes that can be really interesting. And you're like, maybe I want to be a mystery writer, and like, wow, this university actually literally has classes in crime writing, which is a thing. Again, that is a thing you can study. So start looking around for stuff like that because this is going to be 3 or 4 years of your life. Um, so definitely start looking around just to see what's out there as university courses, because you could find that, you know, the direction you want to take becomes obvious once you start doing that. Another thing just to keep in mind is that um, you want to kind of learn the tools of your trade. Um, if you don't read, you probably cannot do that well as a writer. The only exception I would say is for something like games writing, where if you're a gamer, and you may not do a huge amount of reading necessarily, but at the same time, if you have a critical mind and you understand the structure of games writing, because it works very differently from a book, because every step of the way you have to write the choices that the characters or the avatars or the player is presented with. So it's actually really quite complex. Um, but yeah, you absolutely need to be a reader so that you've got the sort of imprint of stories and how stories work in your head. And you have to approach it with a critical mind and critical thinking skills. And I say this a lot. If you're studying creative writing, what you're really studying is critical thinking. And the reason for that is we all have like the built-in ability, if you will, to understand stories. And we have this instinctive ability to understand that if a story doesn't make sense, we're going to know. And so that's something that I have to emphasize a lot in my teaching and like on the course with the staff that I manage. We're teaching creative writing because we're teaching critical thinking skills. It has to make sense. Um, and if it doesn't, the reader or the player or the viewer, the audience, whatever, is quickly going to know that, like, you kind of broke your own rules here. Um, and along those lines, I really encourage you to start thinking critically if this is of interest at all. Start thinking critically when you're reading a book. Think about how the writer put the prose together. How do they choose their words? Are you reading a passage where it feels like the sentences just move slowly? Are you feeling like the whole story is like moving very quickly, moving very slowly? Think about the characters. Why did they do this? Can you always tell what are the characters' reasons for doing things? And does it feel like they're being consistent along the way? And as you're watching something on TV, if you're watching a film, think about it the same way. Like, why is this character doing this? Has this been consistent with everything we know about them so far, or has something changed and we don't know why yet? Um, when you're watching TV, again, reading film, think about the way that people are speaking. Do people really speak that way in real life, or does it sound kind of forced and awkward and weird? That's the kind of critical thinking you want to start developing. While you're reading, I actually, when I was a kid, I knew that I wanted to write. And so, because I'm a masochist, I would read something the first time for enjoyment. And if I really liked it and I felt like I wanted to learn something from this, then I would literally go back and read it a second time to kind of analyze the writer's language. And so by doing that, that allowed me to kind of have my enjoyment. So I could read the story, I could, totally be into it, but then I'd also be aware, like, okay, I'm really into this. This is great. Okay, let's see what this writer is doing. And so I would actually take that second read, even of a book that was that thick. I would read the thing twice back to back, and look at, like, okay, how do they set up their sentences? What are the words they're using? What are the transitional words and phrases they're actually moving me through the text with? How do they move their characters through space? Which may sound really simple, but like if you're thinking about it, you know, how often is it necessary to tell the reader that the characters walked across the room? Um, is something about the way that they're walking important, or is it just enough to say that they did it? Can you imply that they did it? And that kind of thing is just that's really foundational to so much of writing because you have to decide, like, there are several ways you can cover this information, whether it's movement through space, whether it's action, whether it's the events in a plot, whether it's, the way that people interact. How much of it do you spread out and actually cover in detail because those tiny details matter versus, do you just mention they've walked across the room, they've gone into a different room now, blah, the story goes on. So you really, really want to develop that kind of critical thinking so that you know what you're watching and you start to develop insight into why the writer did it this way. Where are they going with it? Um, and then the third thing I want to recommend that you start thinking about now, and again, I'm definitely going to sound like an elderly school teacher with glasses here, and I'm older than I look, actually. Um, Grammar, spelling, punctuation. That is just so important because the students who do well have a good handle on that stuff. And just the reality is, the competition for jobs, the competition for publication opportunities is just massive. And so you want to set yourself out by being somebody who has a really good handle on this stuff. Because when an experienced editor sees something written by somebody who clearly has a good technical command of the language that's impressive, and when they see something from somebody and the verb tenses are a mess and the grammar is a mess and the sentences are a mess, no serious person is going to accept that or, move forward with it. So a couple of, whoa, I should not have touched my mouse. So just a couple of quick things before I wrap up. I'm aware that time is, the sand is running out of the hourglass. So think about books. Obviously there's like the writing, the writer fantasy, the famous writer who gets to tour the world and say important things to people and like wear, very comfortable shoes. Think about books also in terms of the communities that they can create. Think about them in terms of the doors that they can open and the way that, like, you can often be a writer, have books coming out and then have a whole nother career going on at the same time. And the advantage of that is that on the one hand, you get to do all this cool stuff. And I've done a lot of cool stuff. I've gotten to travel. I've gotten to meet a lot of people. I've sold film rights. I've had my stuff translated into multiple languages. Um, but then also, I have another career that I enjoy as well. And so you can do those two things in tandem, usually kind of reasonably well, if you can manage your time a bit. So, think about it not just in terms of the fantasy, but also like it can really fit in nicely with a couple of other things at the same time. Um, I'd also really encourage you to start thinking strategically. So, start, looking online, look in bookstores. What's popular on Netflix? What's selling well? Why is it selling well? The genres that really sell well are things like romance, erotica, mystery, crime. That stuff sells. Think about if you pass through an airport or a train station and you see the bookstore, what are the books on the rack? What are the books with only one copy left? If you look if you've passed a bookstore and you pay attention to what's left on the racks or the display tables, which ones have only like a copy left, and then which ones, have a whole stack of books. That kind of thing is actually really useful because you pick up a lot just by noticing the patterns of, what's on the display tables, what's been selling, what are people reading. If that also kind of coincides with something that you want to write, there could be an opportunity there because that stuff, people buy it. And the thing you might not realize too is that when ebooks happened, a lot of those genre titles, like the romance, the erotica, the sparkly silver vampires, the 50 Shades of Purple, a lot of that stuff was selling better than people saw because people were reading them as ebooks. And so it was on their Kindle, so you wouldn't have to see the lurid cover, at the gym or on the train or something like that. So start thinking strategically like that. Actually, one of my staff that I work with at Falmouth has a whole side gig as a writer, and she actually self-publishes a great deal of that kind of thing under a pen name. She doesn't tell us her pen name because I think what she writes might actually be quite smutty, but the point is like it's a solid, steady income that she and her, it's actually a business partner, have developed, and they do okay. It's a steady income, but it's something that you have to put work into. And so I'm just going to wrap up by promising not to touch my mouse again before I finish. It's a strange time for the humanities in higher education. There's a lot of focus on STEM, and the humanities like this are so important just because they really teach us how to think. And that's something that is so vitally needed right now. So that's why I'm really happy when there's interest in studying creative writing, because I really strongly feel like what we're doing is teaching people how to think. And the material that we create, whether it's books, whether it's TV series, films, what have you, um, this is where we take the culture. We're the people producing the cultural content. And it helps if you're a writer and like you're not just producing the culture, but you're one of the educated, smart, brainy ones. We need more of that. And so, yeah, there's just such a huge demand for creatives right now, whether it's with writing, whether it's in other branches of the visual arts, we are needed. So, that is what I had to cover. I think I've managed to do that in 20 minutes.